No. Mm-mm. No. No. You know, sometimes I watch one of my old videos and I cringe just a little bit. Today is one of those days that I'm cringing. In 2016, I made a video about EQ, but I don't think I really did a very good job of explaining just how critical and how important an EQ or an EQ pedal can be. First of all, we need a guitar part to really demonstrate this with. As I'm playing through a deluxe reverb, of course, it's reissue, and I'm going to play through the Boss DS1, as you probably figured out by now. And let's manipulate the EQ around it first and talk about some tricks around that and try to understand EQ a little bit better. Okay, let's start with the clean tone. This is my clean tone right here. On a clean tone, oftentimes you don't hear subtle EQ tweaks. I think you kind of tend to hear those subtle tweaks on like a distorted tone a little bit more, but there's still some general things with EQ that we can want to do. So overall, here's what I would kind of say some different frequency bands are going to get you when we're talking about guitar tones. All right, so let's start at about 80 hertz. 80 hertz is generally going to be more of a rumble, more of a thump, and you're probably going to hear it more in like a distorted tone. In fact, a lot of these EQ options, when you put the EQ after any sort of distortion, you're going to find that you sort of hear the sound of it a little bit more just because of a lot of different things going on with compression and harmonics and that sort of thing. So overall, let's start with the clean tone. We'll go to the distorted tones after each one, but we'll start at 80 hertz. 125 hertz to about 150 hertz or so, that's generally going to be where you find the bass control on a lot of guitar pedals, is generally around that area. Sometimes a little bit lower, but usually I find about 120 works about the best for guitar pedals. It gives a little more bass content to your ears, so to speak. 300 hertz to about 400 hertz sort of gives it this roundness to it. So a lot of times if there's too much in this frequency spectrum here, it tends to sound muddy. 650 hertz to about 800 hertz or so, that generally is what we would generally call that a lower mid-range. Tube screamers, for example, are about 720 hertz or so. That's kind of where they peak in the middle for the most part. And then something that's more like the Klon type of circuit, that's a little bit more like 1K. So let's check out this lower mid-range. Now we get to a little bit higher mid-range. It's about 1K, 1000 hertz to about 1200 hertz. 2.2K to about 2.8K, or again, 2200 hertz to about 2800 hertz, is generally a lower treble. So sometimes you'll see tone controls around this frequency, but usually it's a little further up. And about 5K to 6K or so, this is a little bit more of a higher treble, just as far as guitar pedals are concerned, because of course the speaker takes off a lot of treble of the frequency spectrum. But generally, this is where I tend to like more of the treble controls on this sort of range. And yeah, it's a little bit more satisfying to the ear, I think. Now, around 8K or so is going to give you a little bit more what I would call presence or sizzle, clarity, that sort of thing. It's a fairly high frequency speaker. The guitar speaker cabinets generally take off a lot of this. So as we're adding to it, it's not going to get incredibly bright generally, but it's going to still add quite a bit of presence. And then 10K is a really high frequency. Sometimes you don't even hear it in the actual amp that much, just because, again, speaker. Some people tend to feel like this kind of gives it air of a sort. And there's a lot of pedals that actually don't, a lot of EQ pedals that don't even have this area on their sliders. So let's see what 10K does. All right, which brings me to a little extra bonus, a little extra tip that I like to use. So rather than using EQ whenever you have like a really crispy top end, I like to do this a lot with Vox style amps and Fender style amps, on clean tones especially. Because sometimes you'll hit just like certain notes, you're like, whoa, that one's really bright. Rather than using EQ to try to carve that, a lot of times when I'm working with a DAW, I'll find that frequency, then I'll use a DeEsser instead. Because a DeEsser is kind of like a multiband compression, but you're just compressing the high end in certain frequency areas. So it's not like it's actually EQing it, it's just compressing whenever it goes over a certain threshold. I know that sounds very technical, but you can kind of see it. So this is just a simple DeEsser in Logic Pro, and whenever I exceed the threshold, you'll see this little area here will be yellow. It's just showing you it's compressing. So first of all, I like to find that frequency. So let's find that. When you use a narrow Q, that's the Q right there. Big O Q, big O narrow Q. I'm looking for things that are going to kind of ring out in a weird way as I sweep across this. Okay, do you hear that whistling sound? That's what I'm looking for. I look at that, I'm like, oh, that's about 3.1K. So rather than use EQ, I'll go to my DeEsser. Turn it up just a smidge right there. I'll try to take it, quote unquote, out with a DeEsser. Now, notice that little yellow area that was popping up. That was basically telling us that it's compressing just a little bit on those frequencies at those points, at that time. So with the DeEsser, you're not really changing the tone like an EQ. You're just kind of eliminating maybe some harsh frequencies that a particular speaker may have, or even mic'd up in a certain situation. Maybe the mic's just doing weird things, or maybe overall, in the context of the band, you're just hearing this weird frequency, and you're like, what is that odd noise? Let's see what it does on distortion. And notice you can really hear a ton on the distortion. So let's try the DeEsser as well on that. Now, if we compare that to the EQ, it's just a different sound. So there you go, two different approaches to fixing the same problem. All right, so what's the point of all this anyways? Basically, it's this. EQ pedals and EQ in general is one of the most important things you can do to your tonality. Guitar tone, vocal tone, bass tone, even drums. So it's really, really important. In the context of having an actual EQ pedal, again, you can sculpt all kinds of things. This might even be even more important than what guitar you're using or what pickups you're using, in my opinion, of course. And also, as we saw, I wish there were a lot more DeEsser pedals. I tried to find one. I didn't even see one. I think there was one kind of a few years ago that was just more like a simple filter. It wasn't really like an actual DeEsser. There are some kind of multi-band EQs. I haven't played them, so I don't have a really good opinion on it. But yeah, I would like to have one on my board. Maybe I should make one. I don't know. So hope you enjoyed this. See you later.